Hi guys, welcome back to our channel, Neesay Thinks. Today we'll be talking about colored masculinities.
So if you like our content, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. I was thinking about colored masculinities based off of what we were chatting about last week, a few days ago actually. So I've got a few questions that I think maybe we can chat through and just have a discussion on that.
So if you recall, last time around we were talking about our experiences growing up as brown queer boys in this world, and that led us to a discussion about colored masculinities.
I think the first thing that I'd ask you, Sean, from your perspective, if you hear that term colored and masculine together, what does that recall for you?
So for me, I mean, being colored is very much tied to place for me. So it's located in a Cape Flats experience, and understand that there are other experiences out there, but it's very much related to that idea of a brain mens, But those ideas also I started to unmake it later in life. And we were talking about being an outsider in a kind of a mainstream world last time around. And I remember in my high school experience, I was called the Zulu boy, So I very much also understood that even if I was being recognized as colored, right, there was still kind of degrees of or lines that would separate people even within that kind of social identity. What comes to mind for you?
I think for me, before I delve into that, I just want to read for our global audience a wiki line about what the colored is, for those of you who don't know. So Wikipedia says, coloreds are a multiracial ethnic group native to Southern Africa who have ancestry from more than one of the various populations inhabiting the region, including Khoisan, Bantu, whites, Austronesian, East Asian, and South Asian. Because of the combination of ethnicities, different families and individuals within a family may have a variety of different physical features. I think this is it's interesting and it's problematic as a description of what colored people are, because it just goes, well, this is what they physically. It kind of leans into racial essentialism for me, something that I have a massive problem with.
So that's exactly why I think, these kinds of definitions of what terms are, and I'm glad you said that it's a term that you're sharing, but you're problematizing that definition.
Yes.
Because ideas of racial mixture tend to suggest that there's a specific mix or category of people, an essentialist notion that we can draw on and say that this is the heritage.
Yeah.
And the history of coloredness is very much rooted in the history of slavery here in the Cape specifically. So there's no one way to kind of solidify that identity, but if you can think about it as kind of cross-cultural contact that sits within relations of racial power that were solidified through the label colored. But colored at one point also meant very different things. At some point, even Asian people were included in the category of colored here in South Africa. If we look at the history, if we look at the legal kind of history of the term itself. So those very definitions tend to morph and change. They're not stable at all.
I think for me, just when I think of colored and I think of masculinity, what immediately recalls for me is not so much kind of a descriptor, but it's more of a feeling, right? And to be quite honest, so that feeling of not being safe. Because I think for me, colored masculinities have always been, my experience of colored masculinity has always been kind of hypermachismo, dangerous, abusive, etc. So this idea of masculinity being this state that needs to exert power and control over those who don't exhibit masculinity, right? So that's really kind of how I've experienced masculinity and how others around me have kind of internalize those values and then express those towards others around them. Colored is, I've always experienced it as boundary policing. So it's and also this idea of not being enough, right? So being a mixture of something that was pure and then being this kind of creature that's now mixed. So you kind of a mongrel. So there are those kind of, and yes, I'm speaking about the negative, but those are the things that are kind of very close to the top for me.
Yeah, so that soundbite descriptor of colored experience as being not black enough, not white enough, was something that I always knew was out there, and I experienced it kind of socially, but within my immediate family, it wasn't real for me. Being colored was almost even fluid to that extent, because I knew my grandfather was a black man. So there was always not that heritage to draw on as another kind of authentic blackness or another notion of authenticity, but my coloredness was always through the prism of this isn't a stable thing and this isn't a uniform thing. My experience of colored masculinity was interesting because in the way that I experienced those very same discourses of violence, and the stereotype of the colored gangster, perhaps, I also experienced a different kind of masculinity being performed by older men around me that wasn't rooted in that. So you mentioned earlier on about masculinities in the plural. So for me, there was kind of this plurality, multiplicity of performances. For better or for worse, also made me place stock in different things. But I'm not saying that I didn't experience the violence of a man has to be powerful. And that even power there is an interesting thing. Because if you think about power as a relative thing, then a colored man maybe have power and experience that discourse of being a strong man to one extent, but within the racial hierarchy that exists in South Africa, apartheid and colonial South Africa, it's very much a power that's relative to white masculinity. So it's disempowered in that extent. So I think, we should keep doing the kind of toing and froing with that. It's essential.
Yeah, look, so like I said, so top of mind for me when I recall this term of masculine and coloredness and how colored men performed their masculinity, it was through the performance of dominance, right? So dominance, which veered to abuse, etc. So, but that wasn't the only kind of, once again, if we're going to pluralize, that wasn't the only way that I saw around me that people performed being colored and being a man, right? So yes, there were other ways that colored men moved through the world and that I saw around me. People that were caring, nurturing, supportive, etc. So those kind of performances of masculinity were definitely around me and that I was able to benefit from. I think it was also interesting to see how those different masculinities sat in a hierarchy as opposed to a spectrum. So with the most violent and most access to power being at the top. So for me, I don't see those masculinities as sitting in kind of an even spectrum, but rather set vertical in a hierarchy because of what was valued, right? Or what is valued.
Power is an interesting term for me. Because we often think of power as something that someone can collect, right? And they can claim and then they can exert some force. But I believe in as much as we all can be disempowered, we can all also possess some degree of power. So this idea of colored masculinity being performed through power, but it being a relative power in relation to maybe perhaps white masculinities is interesting, because I also saw men in addition to gaining some sort of power through violence and maybe gangsterism, and you can also problematize that as an alternative family structure. I saw men gaining other forms of power through and leadership through positions in the church, in the mosque, right? Which was a form of power and empowerment that I don't think one can naturally or immediately categorize as negative. A form of power that didn't immediately disempower others. So it's an interesting kind of negotiation that I particularly respect older colored men in my community for, because they had to negotiate the apartheid structure in terms of having to gain a sense of self, but that self also constantly being challenged.
And using the resources, whether social, cultural, etc., that were available to them within that context. So yeah, look. So I think that's kind of top of mind when I think of this term colored and then the other term masculinity. So I never thought of masculinity as something that I could access, right? Or because of my queerness, I never thought that I could own that, right? And what did that really mean to me? Because I felt like I was someone peering in from the outside. And I just looked at this and I thought, this is fucking crazy. It was so performative. I could see it was performative. I didn't have the language at that age to describe what I was kind of sensing, but I could see the performativity in it. And I realized from a utilitarian perspective, of course, it made sense why this was happening. But the constructedness, as you say, this notion of social construction, of masculinity being a social construct, it was kind of clear even when I was a goober. So
it's weird. I would never describe myself as masculine. I mean, we talked about this idea of claiming the other day, and how important claiming is, and how it can be important for the self, but also performing that claim gives people a way of reading you, of relating to you. So masculinity for me was only something that I sort of thought about really later in life as something that do I want this? Do I want to claim this? But I've never described myself as masculine. I mean, I don't know if you have experience on those dating sites, when you need to say what you are and how you perform yourself. And I never went there. And it's not just that I didn't feel it. And I wasn't immune to the degree of distancing that the term had. So I knew it pushed me somewhere towards a periphery, but it wasn't ever something that I claimed in any way, even though I felt distanced by it.
Look, in queer spaces, I knew that I had to perform a type of masculinity to be desirable. So queerness positions masculinity as desirable, right? So, but a very specific type of masculine performance, right? So we value that in the queer community, especially in the gay male community. We value that type of performance, even though we acknowledge that it's very much a performance, we still value it, right? And
that's I think that what you just said about even though we acknowledge that it's a performance, we still value it. Identity for me, in a way, especially this notion of it being constructed. And again, that's not to say that it doesn't have real world effects. But masculinity is a costume. Do you know what I'm saying? It is the thing that you put on, and that's valued for strategic reasons, but it was never something that I located kind of a definitive sense of shorn in.
That's very interesting.
But the degree to which it is valued in the queer community, definitely. And that's why I think about this idea of that construct of masculinity. It's very difficult, and you mentioned being able to separate the terms, but it's very difficult to think about masculinity outside of something for me. Because that performance of masculinity related to maybe how you dress, your experiences in the bedroom, your finances, all of that to me, to some extent, if I think about it, is also gendered.
Yeah, look, the thing is that you also, and just for those viewing, I just want to clarify a couple of things. Number one, just because something is socially constructed, that doesn't mean that it's not real, or that it doesn't have real social impact, right? So socially constructed is not a fancy way to say not real. It's very real. And then the other thing is that we need to be very, very careful when we talk about masculinity. That is very much embedded within a particular cultural and linguistic framework. So when I'm talking about masculine, I mean it within the South African cultural context, and deeper within the colored cultural context. Because there is no universal way to perform masculinity. So the minute you get onto a plane and you travel to somewhere else, you'll realize that is true. We assume there's some kind of universalizing consensus around these descriptions, but there really isn't.
And in truth, you don't even have to get on a plane.
No, you don't.
So you can maybe take a taxi to a different part of town, and you can see masculinity being performed differently. You can see masculinities become apparent.
Yeah.
And the benefit of that, or the harmfulness of that, is that it can easily feel like something you can't access, or another norm that subjects you to a particular kind of behavior or sense of self that can be alienating. But the beauty of it is also that you get exposed to difference. So people who kind of entool and enliven themselves in different ways using different tools. And that for me is also interesting, because it gives you the chance to kind of go, oh, I'm going to take this from that and this from that, and bring it back to how I make myself in this moment. And that for me also means that there's the opportunity to change. No?
Yeah, so I think for me as a queer man, as a gay man, I look at masculinity as something that I can pick up and put down when and if I need to. Realizing that it has currency, and I can trade in that currency, right? To the extent that it benefits me, but then the rest I can put down and pick up as I go, rather than being invested in the performance.
So, I mean, that's one thing that I maybe want to kind of problematize, because in my saying that it's something that you can entool and enliven in different ways, I'm not suggesting that you can pick up and put down, because of the way reality very much is structured, and we're always moving. There's very little time to kind of pause and reflect on, why do I think the way I think? Why do I feel the way I feel? I'm only realizing in these moments that, okay, I actually never really put that part of masculinity down. Or actually, I never even made that conscious choice about this. It always just felt common sense to me. And common sense is a term that sounds like a soft term. It sounds very neutral, but it is actually it can be a very violent one itself, because something becomes almost so natural that it becomes it's not questioned, and it becomes, this is just the norm and how it's supposed to be. So it's when we can also problematize those issues or those ideas that this is just the way things are, that we begin to realize, no, it wasn't an exchange that I was necessarily an equal partner in.
Yeah, and I don't. I mean, this agency that I'm claiming to you, that I have this agency to put down and pick up this performance as I see fit. I do feel to some extent it's true, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of unexamined assumptions still like bubbling inside of me that I sit with and that, you know, pop up after a certain point.